It started not with a bang, but with a whisper. A rumor that floated through the dusty streets of Kabul and the sterile halls of Washington. A rumor of money. Not just pocket money, but pallets of it. Wooden pallets, stacked high with shrink-wrapped bricks of crisp, new $100 bills. This was the currency of the new Afghanistan, delivered in the dead of night on unmarked CIA cargo planes. The United States spent over $2 trillion on the war in Afghanistan. It is a number so large it loses all meaning. But a significant portion of that war wasn't fought with missiles or tanks. It was fought with cash. Billions of dollars in physical currency, flown into a war zone with the goal of buying loyalty, building an army, and creating a stable democracy from the ashes of the Taliban's regime. But that money didn't build a democracy. It built a kleptocracy, an empire of thieves. It funded a level of corruption so vast, so brazen, that it rotted the entire country from the inside out. This is not a story of nation building. This is the story of the greatest, most audacious heist in modern history. A heist that was bankrolled by the American taxpayer, executed in plain sight, and ultimately helped fuel the very enemy the United States was trying to defeat. To understand how it happened, we have to go back to the beginning. In the chaotic months after the 9/11 attacks, as U.S. Special Forces and CIA operatives linked up with Afghan warlords to topple the Taliban, the primary weapon was not the M4 rifle. It was the briefcase full of cash. The CIA needed allies, and they needed them fast. They didn't have time to vet loyalties or check backgrounds, so they bought them. Warlords who had spent years fighting each other, men with brutal human rights records, were suddenly put on the CIA payroll. $100,000 here, $1 million there. It was a short-term solution to a long-term problem. The CIA called it operational funding. But what they were really doing was planting the seeds of a gangster state. As the war transitioned from a covert operation to a full-scale occupation, the flow of cash became a flood. The goal shifted. The U.S. wasn't just trying to kill terrorists anymore, it was trying to build a nation. And that required a government that, on paper, looked a lot like America's. It had a president, a parliament, and ministries. But underneath this thin veneer of democracy, the old system of patronage and power never went away. The warlords simply traded their turbans for suits. They became governors, police chiefs, and defense ministers, and the cash kept flowing. It was delivered directly to the presidential palace in Kabul. Suitcases, backpacks, sometimes entire pallets of it. The CIA's ghost money, as it came to be known, was completely off the books. There were no receipts, no oversight. It was a slush fund designed to give the Afghan president, Hamid Karzai, the power to buy the loyalty of his rivals. But Karzai wasn't just buying loyalty, he was feeding a beast of greed that would soon grow so large it would consume the entire country. The men who received this cash didn't use it to build schools or hospitals. They used it to build personal empires. They bought armored land cruisers. They built gaudy mansions in Kabul that became known as poppy palaces. They sent their families to live in opulent villas in Dubai. And this was just the beginning. The CIA's ghost money was a drop in the ocean compared to the tsunami of international aid and military contracts that was about to hit Afghanistan. The United States and its allies were about to pour billions of dollars into a country with no functioning banking system, no rule of law, and a ruling class that viewed the national treasury as their personal ATM. They were trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The heist was on, and everyone was about to get their cut. The CIA's ghost money was the seed, but the real cancer of corruption grew from the logistical tail of the war itself. When the United States surged over 100,000 troops into Afghanistan, it created a military machine with an insatiable appetite. It needed fuel, food, ammunition, and concrete. It needed a constant river of supplies flowing into hundreds of remote bases scattered across a hostile, landlocked country with virtually no infrastructure. The supply lines were the arteries of the war effort, and they were dangerously exposed. The primary method of moving these goods was by truck, on roads that were little more than dirt tracks, winding through mountain passes controlled by the Taliban. The U.S. military faced a critical problem: how to protect these convoys. They didn't have enough soldiers to guard every mile of every road. The solution they came up with was a multi-billion-dollar contract known as host nation trucking. On paper, the idea was sound. The U.S. would pay private Afghan companies to transport its supplies. It would create jobs, stimulate the local economy, and put an Afghan face on the logistics effort. The contract was worth over $2 billion, a staggering sum of money that immediately attracted every powerful warlord, politician, and businessman in the country. They formed trucking companies overnight. But these new trucking magnates faced the same problem as the U.S. military. Their trucks were being attacked, their drivers killed, their cargo stolen or burned. So they devised their own solution. A solution so cynical, so perverse, it perfectly captures the absurdity of the entire war. They began to pay the enemy. It became an open secret. The Afghan trucking companies, funded by the U.S. Department of Defense, were running a protection racket on an industrial scale. They would hire private security firms, often run by the same warlords who owned the trucks, to guard the convoys. These security firms would then take a cut of the American money and pay off the local Taliban commanders to let their trucks pass safely. In some cases, the Taliban themselves were the security guards. U.S. military convoys, carrying the fuel for U.S. fighter jets and the food for U.S. soldiers, were being escorted through enemy territory by the enemy himself, all paid for with U.S. dollars. It was a perfect circular economy of violence. The American taxpayer was paying the Taliban not to attack the supply lines that were enabling the American war effort. The insurgents were effectively taxing the occupation. The money they earned from this protection racket was then used to buy better weapons, more explosives, and to recruit more fighters to kill American soldiers. A 2009 congressional report concluded that the host nation trucking contract was a significant source of funding for the insurgency. The system was not just corrupt, it was self-defeating. It was a snake eating its own tail. The warlords and politicians who controlled these contracts became fabulously wealthy. They were the ultimate middlemen, taking a massive cut from the American contracts and another cut from the Taliban payoffs. They held positions in the Afghan government by day and ran shadow empires that fueled the insurgency by night. They were playing both sides against the middle, and the only loser was the ordinary Afghan citizen and the American soldier on the front lines. The river of cash had created a class of untouchables, men who were too rich to jail and too powerful to challenge. They had become essential to the war effort, even as they actively undermined it. And the trucking contracts were just one small piece of a much larger puzzle of theft. The real money, the money that would truly boggle the mind, was in the aid and reconstruction sector. The world was about to try and rebuild Afghanistan, and in doing so, they would open the floodgates to a level of graft that would make the trucking scandal look like petty theft. While the trucking contracts funneled money to the insurgents in the field, the reconstruction effort funneled money into the pockets of the Kabul elite. After the fall of the Taliban, a wave of international optimism washed over Afghanistan. The United States, along with its NATO allies and organizations like the World Bank, pledged over $100 billion to rebuild the war-torn country. It was one of the largest foreign aid projects in human history. The goal was noble: to build schools, hospitals, roads, and a functioning government, creating a stable society that would reject extremism. But the reality was a disaster of epic proportions. The money poured into Kabul with little to no oversight. It was distributed through a complex web of international contractors, non-governmental organizations, and Afghan ministries, creating a system that was ripe for abuse. At the top of the food chain were the massive Western contracting firms. Companies like DynCorp and KBR were awarded multi-billion-dollar contracts to oversee massive infrastructure projects. But they often subcontracted the actual work to smaller Afghan firms, taking a huge percentage off the top for management and security. By the time the money trickled down to the local level, a fraction of the original amount was left to actually build the road or the school. This created a perverse incentive. The projects themselves became secondary to the process of winning and managing the contracts. Ghost projects became rampant. A contractor would be paid to build a school in a remote province. They would submit paperwork, photos, and progress reports. But if anyone from the U.S. government actually tried to visit the site, they would be told it was too dangerous. The school never existed. The money simply vanished. The Afghan government itself became the primary vehicle for the theft. Ministries were treated as personal fiefdoms by the powerful men who ran them. The Ministry of Defense, for example, was plagued by the ghost soldier scandal. Commanders would create thousands of fake names on the payroll rosters. The U.S. would send the money to pay these soldiers, and the commanders would pocket the cash. When the Taliban launched an offensive in a province that was supposed to be defended by 10,000 Afghan soldiers, the Americans would discover that only 2,000 of those soldiers actually existed. The rest were phantoms on a spreadsheet, created to steal money. Corruption infected every aspect of daily life. To get a driver's license, you had to pay a bribe. To get a passport, you paid a bribe. To get a government job, you paid a bribe. The police would set up illegal checkpoints, not to look for insurgents, but to extort money from travelers. The judicial system was for sale to the highest bidder. If you were a powerful man, you were above the law. The effect on the Afghan population was devastating. They saw their leaders, men who claimed to be building a new democracy, living in gaudy palaces and driving bulletproof cars, while they themselves remained mired in poverty. They saw the aid money that was supposed to help them being stolen in plain sight. This bred a deep, corrosive cynicism. It destroyed any faith they might have had in their new government. And it created a powerful recruiting tool for the Taliban. The insurgents could point to the corruption in Kabul and say, "See, this is what the foreigners have brought you, a government of thieves. We may be harsh, but we are not corrupt. We offer justice." For many Afghans caught in the middle, the choice was not between good and evil, but between two competing mafias, and one of them, the one funded by the West, seemed utterly hypocritical. The stolen money didn't stay in Afghanistan. It was laundered and smuggled out of the country on an industrial scale. The epicenter of this operation was Kabul International Airport. Kabul International Airport was not just a gateway for troops and supplies, it became the escape hatch for Afghanistan's stolen wealth. Every day, amidst the chaos of military transports and commercial flights, a parallel financial system was operating in the VIP lounges and on the private tarmacs. This was the beating heart of the Kabul bank scandal, an implosion that would expose the breathtaking scale of the corruption and nearly collapse the entire Afghan economy. Kabul Bank was not an ordinary bank. It was founded in 2004 and quickly became the largest private financial institution in the country. If it is in English, use a clear, natural American English accent, meaning hundreds of millions of dollars of American and international aid flowed through its accounts every month. But behind the facade of a modern bank, it was a classic Ponzi scheme, run by a small cabal of politically connected shareholders with direct ties to President Karzai's inner circle. The bank's owners treated its deposits as their personal slush fund. They issued hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent loans to themselves, their friends, and their families, using fake names and shell corporations. The money was not used for investment in Afghanistan. It was used to buy villas in Dubai, luxury cars in Europe, and to bribe politicians to look the other way. The scale of the smuggling operation at Kabul airport was brazen. According to U.S. officials, an estimated $1 billion in cash was being flown out of the country each year. Passengers on commercial flights to Dubai would check in with suitcases literally stuffed with bricks of $100 bills. Customs officials were paid off. The electronic declaration systems were ignored. The private jets of the Afghan elite would fly out with millions of dollars, no questions asked. The money was being laundered through the real estate market in Dubai, which became a safe haven for the stolen wealth of Afghanistan's new oligarchy. On the artificial islands of the Palm Jumeirah, Afghan warlords and politicians owned lavish waterfront properties, living a life of unimaginable luxury, all funded by the aid money that was supposed to be building schools for girls in Kandahar. For years, the U.S. government knew this was happening. Diplomats and intelligence officers wrote scathing reports about the corruption at Kabul Bank. They warned that the bank was a house of cards and that its collapse would be catastrophic. But they were caught in a trap of their own making. The men running the bank were the same men the U.S. was relying on to fight the Taliban and hold the fragile government together. Cracking down on the corruption meant destabilizing their own allies. So, for a long time, they chose to look the other way. But a Ponzi scheme cannot last forever. In 2010, the House of Cards finally collapsed. A whistleblower leaked documents showing the extent of the fraud. Panic ensued. There was a run on the bank, with ordinary Afghans lining up for days, desperate to withdraw their life savings. The bank had imploded. The total loss was merely $1 billion, a sum equivalent to almost 8% of Afghanistan's entire GDP. The subsequent investigation revealed a level of graft that shocked even the most cynical observers. It was a who's who of the Afghan elite. The brother of the president, the brother of the vice president, they all had their hands in the pot. It was a system of theft so ingrained, so total, that it was impossible to separate the government from the criminal enterprise. The Kabul bank scandal was a mortal wound to the international mission in Afghanistan. It proved that the government the United States had spent a decade and billions of dollars building was fundamentally rotten to the core. It was a government of, by, and for the corrupt. And as the international forces began to plan their withdrawal, a final, frantic looting frenzy was about to begin. The thieves knew their time was running out, and they were determined to take everything that wasn't nailed down. The collapse of Kabul Bank was a dress rehearsal for the grand finale of the Afghan heist. As the United States began to draw down its troops between 2011 and the final chaotic withdrawal in 2021, a palpable sense of panic gripped the Afghan elite. The river of Western cash that had sustained their empire for over a decade was about to dry up. The clock was ticking. It was the last chance to steal everything possible before the system inevitably collapsed. This period saw the corruption economy go into overdrive. It became less about subtle graft and more about smash-and-grab looting. Government officials who had previously demanded 10% kickbacks on contracts now demanded 50%, or simply took the entire budget for themselves. The ghost soldier problem, which had already been rampant, exploded. Provincial commanders knew that the American auditors were leaving, so they added tens of thousands of phantom names to their rosters. They were no longer just stealing salaries. They were stealing the entire defense budget of their provinces. This had a devastating effect on the battlefield. As the Taliban launched their final, sweeping offensive across the country in the summer of 2021, the world watched in shock as the 300,000-strong Afghan National Army, an institution that the U.S. had spent $83 billion training and equipping, disintegrated in a matter of weeks. The soldiers on the front lines, many of whom hadn't been paid in months because their commanders had stolen their salaries, had no food, no ammunition, and no fuel. They were abandoned. They had no faith in their leaders and no will to fight for a government that had robbed them blind. They simply laid down their weapons and went home, or, in many cases, surrendered and joined the Taliban. The corruption had not just stolen money, it had stolen the will to fight. It was the single most important factor in the Taliban's victory. The government that the U.S. had built was a hollow shell, a house of cards built on a foundation of stolen cash. And when the wind of the Taliban advance blew, it folded instantly. The final act of the heist took place during the chaotic fall of Kabul in August 2021. As the Taliban entered the city, the top officials of the Afghan government were not organizing a defense. They were at the airport, pushing their way onto planes, their bags filled with the last of the nation's wealth. The Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, fled the country by helicopter. According to the Russian embassy in Kabul, his convoy consisted of 4 cars full of cash. He allegedly tried to stuff so much money into the helicopter that some of it had to be left behind on the tarmac. While thousands of desperate Afghans clung to the outside of U.S. military planes, the men who had looted their country for 20 years slipped away in the night, flying to their villas in Dubai and their mansions in California. They left behind a failed state, a humanitarian crisis, and a population utterly betrayed. So, where did the money go? The simple answer is everywhere. It is in the London real estate market, it is in Swiss bank accounts, it is in the luxury high-rises of the United Arab Emirates, it is in the suburban mansions of Northern Virginia and Southern California, where many former Afghan officials now live in quiet, gated communities. Very little of it ever reached the people it was intended to help. The story of the ghost money is the central tragedy of the war in Afghanistan. It shows how good intentions, when paired with a flood of unsupervised cash and a fundamental misunderstanding of the local culture, can create a monster. The United States didn't just fail to defeat the Taliban, it actively, if unintentionally, funded its own opposition. The corruption didn't just undermine the war effort, it was the war effort's fatal flaw. It created a government so despised by its own people that the return of the Taliban seemed like a preferable alternative. The lesson is a brutal one. You cannot build a nation on a foundation of lies and stolen money. The ghost money of Kabul will haunt the legacy of the American intervention for decades to come, a testament to a war that was lost not on the battlefield but in the bank vaults. The story of the ghost money is often told as a uniquely Afghan problem, a failure of a distant, developing nation. But this narrative is incomplete. It ignores the role of the West in not only tolerating the corruption, but in many cases, actively participating in it. The flood of international money created a gold rush atmosphere, and it wasn't just the Afghans who came to pan for gold. A shadow economy of Western contractors, consultants, and security experts descended on Kabul, drawn by the promise of astronomical, tax-free salaries and lucrative contracts. These were the Gucci guerrillas, the expats who lived in a fortified bubble within the city. They resided in high-security compounds with swimming pools and private chefs, earning $200,000 a year to write reports on gender equality or agricultural reform, reports that would often just sit on a shelf unread. An entire industry of development experts thrived, their success measured not by the results on the ground, but by their ability to navigate the bureaucracy of USAID or the World Bank and secure the next round of funding. The security industry was perhaps the most egregious. Private military contractors were paid billions of dollars to protect embassies, bases, and convoys. This created a perverse incentive where continued instability was good for business. The more dangerous the country, the more security was needed, and the higher the contracts were worth. Some have argued that these firms had a vested financial interest in the war never truly ending. This created a deep and visible hypocrisy. U.S. soldiers were on the front lines, risking their lives for a salary of $30,000 a year, while just a few miles away in the green zone of Kabul, private contractors were earning 10 times that amount to do jobs that were often of questionable value. The Afghans saw this disparity clearly. They saw 2 sets of rules, one for the Westerners in their armored cars and another for the locals living in poverty. Furthermore, the very structure of the aid projects was often deeply flawed. They were typically designed in Washington or Brussels with little understanding of the local context. A classic example was the effort to promote pomegranate farming in Kandahar as an alternative to opium. The U.S. spent millions on this project, but they failed to account for the fact that there was no reliable cold storage and no secure roads to get the pomegranates to market before they spoiled. The opium poppy, on the other hand, is durable. It can be stored for years and is easily transported. The pomegranate project was a catastrophic failure, but the contracts were paid out anyway. This was the fundamental flaw in the Western approach. They tried to impose a top-down, Western-style system on a country that operated on a completely different set of rules. They believed that if they just poured enough money into the system, a democracy would magically appear. They failed to understand that the money itself was the poison. It distorted the economy, it empowered the wrong people, and it created a system of dependency and graft that was impossible to unwind. The international community wasn't just a victim of Afghan corruption, it was an enabler. It was a willing partner in a system that enriched a small elite at the expense of an entire nation. The ghost money didn't just disappear into the pockets of Afghan warlords. It also paid for the mortgages of consultants in Virginia and the private school fees for contractors in London. The heist was an international affair. The legacy of the ghost money is a bitter one, and it raises a question that haunts American foreign policy to this day. Was it worth it? For the ordinary Afghan, the answer is almost certainly no. After 20 years of war and over $100 billion in civilian aid, the average Afghan is poorer and less secure than they were before. The brief gains in women's rights and education that were made in the cities have been brutally erased by the return of the Taliban. The infrastructure that was built is now crumbling or in the hands of the very extremists it was meant to marginalize. The country is facing a humanitarian crisis, with millions on the brink of starvation. For them, the international intervention was a whirlwind of promises that ultimately left them with nothing but dust. For the American taxpayer, the story is one of monumental waste. The trillions spent on the war in Afghanistan could have rebuilt America's own crumbling infrastructure, funded healthcare, or tackled climate change. Instead, it vanished into a black hole of corruption and failed projects, leaving behind little more than a legacy of debt and disillusionment. For the American soldier, the legacy is perhaps the most painful. They fought, bled, and died in those mountains and valleys, believing they were building something better. They were told they were fighting for freedom and democracy. But many now look back on their service with a sense of futility, knowing that the government they were defending was a criminal enterprise and that the war itself was being prolonged by the very money that was supposed to end it. It is a profound betrayal that has contributed to a mental health crisis among veterans. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is the lesson that it offers. The story of the ghost money is a cautionary tale about the limits of power. It demonstrates that you cannot simply buy a nation. You cannot impose a system on a culture you do not understand. And it proves that the most corrosive force in a counterinsurgency is not the enemy's bullet, but the corruption that eats away at the will of the people and the legitimacy of the mission. The war in Afghanistan was not lost on the battlefield. It was lost in the palaces of Kabul, in the vaults of its banks, and in the suitcases of cash flying to Dubai. The Taliban did not win. The Afghan government simply dissolved under the weight of its own greed. And the ghost money was the fuel that fed the fire. It is a story with no heroes, only victims and villains. A grim reminder that the road to hell is often paved with good intentions and unaccountable cash. The cycle of corruption, funded by foreign cash, is not a new story in Afghanistan. It is a ghost that has haunted the country for centuries. The British Empire tried to pacify the tribes with subsidies in the 19th century, only to find that the money was used to buy the very weapons that were later turned against them. In the 1980s, the CIA funneled billions of dollars through Pakistan to the Mujahideen to fight the Soviet Union. That money, known as Operation Cyclone, was instrumental in defeating the Red Army, but it also created the Warlords and the radical jihadist networks that would later morph into Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The U.S. was, in a very real sense, paying to arm its future enemies. What makes the post-2001 era so staggering is the sheer scale of the enterprise. The money involved was an order of magnitude greater than anything that had come before, and the mechanisms for oversight were, in many cases, deliberately weakened. There was a prevailing attitude in the early years of the war that speed was more important than accountability. The goal was to stabilize the country as quickly as possible, and if that meant turning a blind eye to some corruption, it was considered a necessary price to pay. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. It failed to recognize that corruption was not a side effect of the conflict, it was a primary driver of it. For a young, unemployed Afghan man in a rural village, the choice was often stark. He could try to join the Afghan National Army, where his commander might steal his salary and his American mentors might look at him with suspicion. Or he could join the Taliban, who would offer him a small but reliable wage, a sense of purpose, and a chance to fight back against a government he viewed as illegitimate and predatory. The corruption made the Taliban's sales pitch for them. It also created a deep-seated addiction to foreign aid. The entire Afghan economy became distorted, dependent on the constant infusion of Western cash. Legitimate businesses couldn't compete with the politically connected firms that won all the contracts. The country never developed a sustainable, independent economic base. When the money was abruptly cut off in 2021, the entire system collapsed overnight, leading to the economic and humanitarian crisis the country faces today. It is a classic case of the resource curse, but instead of oil or diamonds, the resource was foreign aid. And like any curse, it left a trail of destruction in its wake. The story of the ghost money is a lesson written in blood and treasure, a lesson about what happens when good intentions collide with the complex realities of a broken state. It is a story that should be studied in every military academy and every foreign policy school for generations to come, a stark warning about the dangers of fighting a war with an open checkbook. And so, the final bitter irony of the ghost money is this. The Taliban, the very group the United States spent 20 years and trillions of dollars trying to destroy, are now the inheritors of the scraps of the American-built state. When they swept back into power in 2021, they didn't just capture cities and military bases. They captured the institutions that the corruption had hollowed out. They now sit in the ministries that were once used to loot the treasury. They control the central bank, though its foreign reserves remain frozen. They have inherited a country addicted to foreign cash, a population facing starvation, and an economy in freefall. The great heist is over. The thieves have fled. The money is gone. And the people of Afghanistan are left to pick up the pieces, once again abandoned by the outside world, left to the mercy of the hardline ideologues who have returned to rule them. The poppy palaces of Kabul now stand as monuments to an era of unprecedented greed, their gaudy architecture a testament to a dream that rotted from within. The story serves as a grim epilogue to the American century, a painful example of how the world's greatest superpower, with all its wealth and military might, could be defeated not by an army, but by a spreadsheet. Defeated by ghost soldiers on a payroll, by crooked contracts for roads that were never built, and by suitcases of cash flying out of Kabul in the dead of night. It is a story that proves that the most important battles are not always fought on the front lines. Sometimes they are fought in the quiet, air-conditioned offices where contracts are signed, and in the dark corners where bribes are exchanged. This was a war fought in two arenas. In the valleys, American soldiers fought with courage and honor. But in the palaces, a very different war was being waged, a war for money. And in that war, America and its allies did not just lose, they were comprehensively outplayed. If you want to understand the complexities of modern warfare, you need to follow the money. This has been the story of the Great Afghan Heist. If you found this investigation valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to Afghanistan War Tales. We are dedicated to uncovering the stories that were left on the cutting room floor of history. Next week, we are looking at the enemy from within, the story of the green-on-blue attacks, where Afghan soldiers turned their guns on their American trainers. It is a story of paranoia, betrayal, and the ultimate breakdown of trust in a war with no clear lines. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching.